All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was a great introduction to this evening's session of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights. I'm, of course, Dr. Robert Greene II, the lead instructor for the Modjeska Simkins School, and we welcome you all once again to what should be another very informative edition of our school. Now, tonight, I like to joke that this is The Empire Strikes Back edition of the Modjeska School because it's covering several of the efforts by both federal and state governments to oppose civil and human rights campaigns throughout the 20th century. Now, it's important, of course, as you all know, to not only understand the fights for civil and human rights, but to also understand the forces against which those groups, activists, and organizations have been arrayed against for well over a century or so. While the United States likes to proclaim itself as the world's greatest democracy, at times we have had some difficulties in living up to that particular moniker. So we're going to be talking about that. But before I do that, a couple of things. Number one, last night for our deeper dive session, we had an interview with Armin Durfner and a wonderful Q&A with Vernon Burton. That recording is on YouTube now, has been sent out via email as well. So please check that out as soon as you can. Secondly, I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot here, but I did want to make a brief mention that Taylor Simon's Liberation is Lit bookstore is now open. So let's give Taylor a round of applause. I understand the days it's open are Thursday through
Saturday, 10 to 6, and Sundays 10 to 2.
Okay, so again, that's Thursday through Sunday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 10 to 6, and Sunday, 10 to 2, right?
Yes.
Okay, and it is located on 2769 Rosewood Drive. So I haven't had a chance to make it there myself, but I'll be there pretty soon. So I'm hoping that you all can join us over there as well. So again, Taylor's opened a new bookstore, Liberation is Lit. And this bookstore, it's not just about selling books, it's about the holistic experience of being involved in the struggle for human rights. So again, congratulations, Taylor, on getting that bookstore open. And no, but you know, we are glad again that she's got the bookstore open. So this is fantastic news. It actually ties into tonight's class because one of the things about the Modjeska Simkins School, and more importantly about the Grow Building, is that we have to do our work, our due diligence in building a sense of actual community amongst activists, amongst concerned citizens, and so forth. And places like Grow, Liberation is Lit, and so forth serve an incredibly important purpose in that. And tonight, we're going to see why these kinds of places are so incredibly important, because the forces arrayed against us are pretty powerful, if I do say so myself. So tonight's class is actually a combination of review and also talking about some things that we've had to kind of only briefly make mention of in previous classes, but we want to kind of talk about those more in depth this evening. Tonight's class, of course, is Progress and Repression in American History. And as I was telling Chris a moment ago before class began this evening, I started tonight's presentation with a photograph of a young Modjeska Simkins, because it's important to note that Modjeska Simkins was alive for everything we're talking about this evening, about HUAC, the Dice Committee, about COINTELPRO, and so many other forces that were arrayed against human and civil rights organizations throughout American history. The good news, though, is that one reason these forces were so oppressive is that they were faced with some really impressive individuals and organizations, about which we'll learn more about this evening. Now, I want to take us back. We've kind of gotten to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but I want to go back for a second to the beginning of the 20th century. Historians like to say that the past is another country. And certainly what we're going to see this evening is a very, very different kind of country from the one we live in today. For one, turn of the 20th century, there was actually a relatively strong socialist party in the United States. And we've kind of made mention of them before in this class, but I think it's especially important for us to talk about this tonight because their power and influence is something that I think, for example, the Democratic Socialists of America today would greatly envy. But when we're thinking about the Socialist Party, we tend to focus primarily on one man in particular, Eugene Debs, the gentleman you see on the left-hand side of the screen here. Debs ran for president several times as a Socialist Party candidate. At the turn of the 20th century, Debs was one of the best known public speakers in the country, and he was certainly America's foremost leader in socialism and the Socialist Party. Now, Debs actually got his start organizing on railroad unions and the like in the late 1880s and 1890s, and by 1900 was fairly convinced that the Socialist Party offered the best solution to America's problems. Now, this was not just a pie in the sky idea. Remember in 1900, nations in both Western Europe and North America were already signed to several strong socialist parties. In Great Britain, we had the rise of the Labour Party. In France, there was a major communist party. In Germany, there was the Social Democratic Party. And in the United States, you had a socialist party and also things like the Progressive Party. You had the populists that had risen and fallen in the late 19th century. And the socialists in the US did not just run Debs for president. They actually had positions on city councils across the country. They had positions like Minneapolis and elsewhere in the Midwest. They practiced what was called sewer socialism, where the Socialist Party became popular because it dealt with everyday bread and butter issues. There were even socialists in Congress as well, from the Midwest and the Northeast. But Debs was the best known member of the Socialist Party. And for many Americans living in the Northeast, the Midwest, even in states like Oklahoma, for instance, there was a genuine sense that the Socialist Party was, if not the party of the present, at the very least, the party of the future.
Dr. Greene, you know, we lifted up a 1912 announcement in the state newspaper of the Richland County Socialist Party. And so it even happened here. And Debs was the Simkins' #1 hero. And she was very irritated that she couldn't vote for him when he was in prison in 1920.
Which we'll get to in just a moment. But Debs wasn't the only avatar of radical interest in the 1900s and 1910s. As we've discussed already, the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, was also making its presence felt in labor activism in the early 20th century. This is actually a cartoon of the IWW showing what they really stood against, right? So you see the figure of the IWW fighting against low wages, fighting against long hours, rotten conditions, speed up system. And on the bottom left, you see here also militarism, right? So I want to show this cartoon in part because it shows how people involved on the left for well over a century have made these connections between labor, between race, gender, and also imperialism. Spoiler alert, we'll come back to this also later in tonight's presentation. But again, the IWW was deeply concerned with some of these serious issues. Okay, actually, let me just do something really quickly. Just saw something about in the chat, slideshow not changing. Give me just 1 second. But the problem with these movements, and again, what you're seeing in the early 20th century is how so many of these movements are coalescing around issues of labor activism, and the like, is that they are running into continued repression from the federal government. Of course, the IWW, even before America's entry into the Great War, was seen as an organization that was far too radical for the taste of the federal government. But the Great War itself gave President Woodrow Wilson a wonderful opportunity in which to really enforce rules and regulations that severely curtailed freedom of speech in the United States. Now, one of the lessons of American and world history is that whenever a nation goes to war, usually the first casualty is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And that was certainly the case in the Great War. As soon as the United States declared war on Imperial Germany in April 1917, Congress went ahead and passed first the Espionage Act in 1917, and then the Sedition Act in 1918. In essence, these acts criminalized speaking out against America's entry into the Great War. They criminalized dissent against the war. And I think the natural question is, well, how do they define dissent during the Great War? The answer was yes. What I mean is, almost anything and everything that could be thought of as speaking out against the war could be perceived as breaking the Espionage and Sedition Act. Now, President Wilson was more than eager to allow his federal government to use these powers during the Great War, but it's also worth noting that by 1917, there had been considerable debate within the United States about what constituted an American citizen. For example, Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson alike, who didn't agree on much of anything, both agreed with the criticism of Americans who were referred to as hyphenated Americans. German Americans, Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Jewish Americans, immigrants from Europe and elsewhere. There was a common critique that you should drop the first part of that and just refer to yourself as American, but this really went into overdrive during the Great War. There was suspicion, especially cast on German Americans during that conflict. Not quite what we see with Japanese Americans during World War II in internment camps, but some German Americans are arrested and put in prison during the war simply for being German American. But the Espionage and Sedition Acts also target a great deal of radicals and radical influenced activists, including folks like Emma Goldman, who by the 19-teens was well known as an anarchist, was seen as a valuable ally of a wide range of left-wing and radical movements. And not surprisingly, Emma Goldman spoke out against America's entry into the Great War. Now, for her troubles, Goldman was arrested, put in prison, and was eventually deported by the US government out of the United States. This was a fate that also belied other activists who had been born outside the US. And during the Great War, there were questions raised not just of their loyalty, but quite literally of their citizenship as well. And Goldman was one of the most prominent victims of the Espionage Act of 1917. Also, many Black Americans had reason to be worried about speaking out against the Great War. For example, A. Philip Randolph, who we see here in his younger years, at one point was actually arrested along with Chandler Owen, co-founders of the Messenger magazine, for also speaking out against the Great War. Now, of course, Randolph, unlike Goldman, was not deported. In fact, Randolph, when he was arrested, the judge threw out the charges because the judge had a hard time believing a Black person could speak out against the war in a coherent fashion. But this shows you the extent to which the federal government became very repressive during the Great War and really targeted folks who were speaking out against that conflict. Now, most Americans think of World War II as the good war. That's the one war in US history most Americans can agree on was a good one that we actually fought in, although even that in the 1940s was up for debate. The Great War, on the other hand, was incredibly controversial from the moment the US entered it in April 1917. In fact, one of the reasons there was a draft in the Great War was that many Americans initially did not volunteer to fight in said war. You had protests against the draft, against the war itself, all across the country. The biggest hotbed for anti-war radicalism was actually in the Midwest, places like Oklahoma and Kansas, that were once centers of the populist movement in 1917, 1918, spoke out against the Great War as well. But what you see is that the federal government's repression proved to be successful during the war years in not only crippling the anti-war movement, but really dismantling this larger radical movement of the socialists, of the IWW, that had grown to immense strength by 1917. In some ways, when we're talking about the history of American activism, there is this big disjointive moment in 1917 to 1920, as there is right after World War II, as we discussed last week. For instance, thanks to the Espionage and Sedition Acts, the once vibrant foreign language press in the US. Yes, there was once in this country a very vibrant foreign language press. So newspapers in German and Yiddish and Russian, Polish, thanks to large amounts of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. That press was largely dismantled by 1919, 1920, because many of those papers were seen as being subversive during the Great War years. The masses, popular magazine, The Left, which was very influential for generations of socialists, was also destroyed by the Espionage Act as well. So you have a generation of activists, of dissenters, who are facing heavy repression thanks to America's entry into the Great War. Much of this actually culminates in the Palmer raids of 1919, 1920, ordered by Attorney General Palmer, who was greatly concerned with the rise of radicalism in the US during the earliest years of the 20th century. Now, I've said it before and I'll say it again, context is always king when it comes to history. Again, the Palmer raids are taking place at the same time as the first Red Scare is going on in the US, as troops are coming home from the war, and also as the Russian Revolution is taking place in Russia. There was a fear in Europe and the US alike that the Russian Revolution would not just stay in Russia, that it would spread through Poland into Germany, might hopscotch across the channel to Great Britain, and some feared would ultimately cross the Atlantic and even engulf the United States as well. And so when you're thinking about the Red Summer of 1919, the anti-Black race riots taking place, the anti-labor counter-activism taking place being done by state, happening in the context of the Russian Revolution abroad and the attempts to stifle dissent at home at the same time. And the Palmer raids that you see here were a major example of the federal government undertaking extraordinary steps to further stifle dissent in the immediate post-war months after World War I formally came to an end. But this perhaps brings us to one of the most visible victims of the Red Scare and of the Great War hysteria, and that is, of course, Eugene Debs himself. Now, if you've been watching the news the last couple of years or so, and folks been talking about a potential candidate for president having to run while facing various felony charges, the like, you may have heard folks mention that there has been someone who's run for president before from prison. And that was, of course, Eugene Debs. And I can assure you that is the only thing Eugene Debs and Donald Trump have in common. And I feel sick to my stomach even saying that. But Debs, unlike Trump, got in trouble with the law, making what John Lewis would call good trouble, where Debs, spoke out against the Great War in 1917. He gave passionate anti-war speeches speaking out against America's entry into the war. And like many other socialists in Europe and the US, he saw the war as a war that was basically destroying the working class. And if you think about how many men died during that war, about 10 million were dead by 1918. Deb's point was a pretty valuable one. It's also worth noting that all of those socialist parties in Europe I just mentioned, the Labour Party in Great Britain, Social Democrats in Germany, the socialists in France, they all end up early on in the war years backing their governments in the Great War. And later on, many of those leaders saw that as a mistake they made getting in the early war nationalist hysteria. But Deb stuck to his guns. He opposed the war and he eventually went to prison for his opposition to the war. And in 1920, he ran for president again, this time running from a jail cell in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was his campaign button for president, convict number 9653. Granted, I do not believe we'll see buttons like this for Trump later this year, regardless of what happens with the court system. But again, this shows you the extent to which American repression became quite overbearing in the post-war years. And I want to go ahead and play one of the clips that Brett sent along earlier this week for this week's class. This is actually a recreation of Eugene Debs speaking out against the war as he is about to go to prison. I want to actually play this clip because I think it actually does a great job capturing what Debs believed in. So let's take a listen to this, and then we'll keep going. And this is Mark Ruffalo reading Debs' statement.
World War I was that of Eugene Debs, the railroad union organizer and leader of the Socialist Party. On June 18, 1918, he addressed a mass rally of workers in Ohio, knowing that his words could lead, as they did, to his arrest and imprisonment. His sentence of 10 years was upheld by a unanimous Supreme Court decision. Here is the speech that led to his arrest.
Sam Johnson declared that patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He must have had the Wall Street gentry in mind, or at least their prototypes. For in every age it has been the tyrant, the oppressor, and the exploiter who has wrapped himself in the cloak of patriotism, or religion, or both, to deceive and overawe the people. Every solitary one of these aristocratic conspirators and would-be murderers claims to be an arch-patriot. Every one of them insists that the war is being waged to make the world safe for democracy. What humbug! What rot! What false pretense! Wars throughout history have been waged for conquest and plunder. In the Middle Ages, when the feudal lords concluded to enlarge their domains, to increase their power, their prestige, and their wealth, they declared war upon one another. But they themselves did not go to war, any more than the modern feudal lords, the barons of Wall Street, go to war. The feudal barons of the Middle Ages, the economic predecessors of the capitalists of our day, declared all wars, and their miserable serfs fought all the battles. The poor, ignorant serfs had been taught to revere their masters, to believe that when their masters declared war upon one another, it was their patriotic duty to fall upon one another and to cut one another's throats for the profit and glory of the lords and barons who held them in contempt. And what is war in a nutshell? The master class has always declared the wars. The subject class has always fought the battles. The master class has had all to gain and nothing to lose, while the subject class has had nothing to gain and all to lose, especially their lives. They have always taught and trained you to believe it to be your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice in declaring war. And strange as it certainly appears, no war by any nation in any age has ever been declared by the people. The working class who fight all the battles, the working class who make the supreme sacrifices, the working class who freely shed their blood and furnish their corpses, have never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace. It is the ruling class that invariably does both. They alone declare war and they alone make peace. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die. That is their motto. And we object on the part of the awakening workers of this nation. If war is right, let it be declared by the people.
If war is right, let it be declared by the people. And again, as they said at the beginning of the clip, when Debs gave this speech in 19 audience, knowing full well the federal government was going to find out about his remarks in fairly short order. They did. He went to trial for what he said, went to prison for what he said, and in 1920 ran for the presidency from prison.
That was his crime. That was it. Speaking out.
And again, I think there's a good lesson here in understanding the price that some of these activists knew they were going to have to pay in order to make a difference in society. Because again, when Debs speaks out against the war in 1918, by that point, there are about 2 to 3 million American men training to go fight in Europe. Some of them have already arrived in Europe. They're already fighting in France. The war is very much well underway for the American people. And by the end of 1918, by the time the war comes to an end, in less than a year of combat, over 100,000 Americans would die in the Great War, along with 10 million more people from all over the world. But unfortunately, in American history, for every Eugene Debs or every Martin Luther King Jr. or every Modjeska Simkins or every Fannie Hamer, there is also always at least one or two J. Edgar Hoovers. And this is actually where J. Edgar Hoover comes into the national picture. If you've ever seen the film, I think it's called J. Edgar, that's about J. Edgar Hoover's life, where he's played by Leonardo DiCaprio, out of all people. It actually covers his entire career, and it actually starts in 1919. By 1919, Hoover was already working in the Bureau of Investigation, which later become known as the FBI, under the Attorney General. And in 1919, he was made, at 24 years old, by the way, he was made the head of the General Intelligence Division, aka the Radical Division of the Bureau of Investigation. In essence, his job was to keep a tab on a variety of so-called subversives, from Emma Goldman to W.E.B. Du Bois to Marcus Garvey to A. Philip Randolph to so many others. And really, Hoover built his career into eventually becoming director of the FBI by his work in the Radical Division. Again, what the government considered a radical is important to note here, because it covered all the folks I just mentioned and many, many other people as well. But thanks to the hysteria of the war years and the Red Summer, individuals like Hoover were able to amass a ton of power within the federal bureaucracy that they utilized against a variety of left-wing movements. And if you don't believe me, let me just show you one website that captures what I'm talking about here. And this is a wonderful resource that I use to scare my students at Claflin with all the time. But this is the Vault. This is an FBI website. And I'll show it to you right now. So the FBI has graciously put online links to a wide range of files they kept on a variety of individuals in American history. So the Vault, you see it on the right-hand side of the page here, it has different categories. It has anti-war, civil rights, counterterrorism, foreign counterintelligence, past the gangster era. So if you're interested in Al Capone and all those guys, they have links to that. They have civil rights. Let's see who's in the civil rights section. Might be some people we actually know. So you've got Rodney King, Betty Shabazz, Bayard Rustin, Mario Savio, the Freedom Riders, Malcolm X, Benjamin Hooks, Fannie Lou Hamer, so on and so forth. Thurgood Marshall, Roy Wilkins. Let's take a look for a second at Rustin, because he was on the FBI's radar for a long time. And again, you don't get the full FBI file of each individual. If you did, it'd be like tons of PDFs. But what they do have are just samples of what they collected on folks like Rustin. So for example, it's kind of hard to read. I'll just zoom in a little bit here. This is showing a file from it began about 1963 or so, about actually the CPUSA, the Communist Party, and its relationship to Bayard Rustin and also Martin Luther King Jr. So again, the FBI has put some of these files online as a way to kind of show you what their own history has been of surveillance of Americans. Now, Brett, I'm not sure if you're on the FBI's Vault website, but I'm sure there are plenty of files on your activities at FBI headquarters, but I digress. But this is the kind of thing that we're talking about here, how Hoover is really the prime mover and shaker in building this large federal bureaucracy that ends up harassing and infiltrating numerous human rights organizations throughout the 20th century. And again, Hoover's efforts would not stop in the 20s, they would continue throughout the 20th century. Part of the reason for this is that he had considerable support from other authorities within the federal government. And by the Great Depression, you're seeing congressmen also come out in support of Hoover and other efforts to monitor so-called subversives. Most notably, the House Un-American Activities Committee, also known as HUAC. Now, in most American history courses, when we talk about HUAC, we talk about them after World War II, with the Second Red Scare and the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But it's important to note that HUAC actually had its origins during the New Deal era in 1938. And its first head was a Democrat from Texas named Martin Dies. He was the sponsor of HUAC's bill through Congress and was first committee chair from 1938 through 1944. Now, you might be asking yourselves, well, who was HUAC investigating in the 1930s and 40s? Well, take a guess. Supposed communists and allies of the Communist Party, which in the 30s and 40s was a very nebulous term. Keep in mind that during World War II, the United States was allied to the Soviet Union. But despite that, Martin Dies continued to investigate so-called communist subversives. Now, it's worth noting, in the 30s, the federal government did also investigate American Nazis, Americans who were aligned with the fascist movement. And some of those activities, some of those investigations went quite far. For example, in 1934, there was a revelation within the federal government of a plot by businessmen in the US to overthrow President Roosevelt. Now, this businessmen's plot, to this day, historians are not sure how far it got. What we do know is that there were some prominent businessmen who talked openly about getting rid of President Roosevelt and of ending the New Deal before it really got off the ground. But HUAC did briefly investigate some American fascists, but for the most part, investigated folks on the left. For example, there were some critics who said to HUAC, well, why are you investigating the Ku Klux Klan, for example? You can't get more subversive than that. Dyes's response was, well, the KKK is actually an American organization. Why should we investigate them? They're as American as apple pie. But again, a lot of the groups that we think of as having their origins in the Second Red Scare began well before that. And actually, Congressman Dyes was actually criticized during World War II for this, because there were many who said, well, why aren't you trying to, root out Nazi sympathizers or Nazi spies in the US, which, by the way, there was a serious problem with that during the war years. But despite that, HUAC was still investigating communists and the like. And by 1944, Martin Dyes, funny enough, decides not to run for re-election because within the Democratic Party, there were more and more liberals in Texas speaking out against Dyes and his leadership of HUAC. Because he wasn't only targeting communists, he was, not surprisingly, also targeting folks who supported the New Deal as well, seeing that as a plot by communists to overthrow the government from within. But HUAC is going to pretty soon become synonymous with the Second Red Scare, with Senator Joseph McCarthy and his efforts in the post-World War II years to target basically anyone and everyone who he felt had some sort of affiliation, communism, or the American left. And this is actually a cartoon from 1947. It shows you a car that they're writing. It's labeled Committee on American Activities. And the title of it says, "It's okay, we're hunting communists." Essentially showing how even during the height of the Red Scare, there were many Americans who were uneasy with how far the government was going to root out supposed subversives. Now, the Second Red Scare would ruin the lives of thousands of Americans. For example, during the Second Red Scare, you have what's known as the Lavender Scare, where gay and lesbian Americans were ferreted out of the federal government by the hundreds because of their sexual orientation. Many of them were fired from government positions because of the fact that they were gay or lesbian. They were seen as being liabilities during the Cold War. But perhaps the most prominent example of victims of the Second Red Scare include a couple of gentlemen in this photograph. From left to right is Paul Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Congressman Vito Marcantiano, who was actually a congressman from Harlem in the 1940s, and actually, I think at this point, the most prominent socialist in the country at that time. Now, Robeson and Du Bois had been friends in the 1930s. Du Bois played a critical role in, sorry, let me go back for a second, in really helping Robeson with his political awakening. A few folks are saying they can't see the PowerPoint change. Going out and re-entering it again. But during the World War II years, Robeson becomes increasingly outspoken in his opposition to repression at home in the US and more outspoken in his support for communism abroad. Du Bois is also raising some critical questions about the relationship between race and class in the 30s and 40s. In 1935, he writes Black Reconstruction in America. In the 1940s, when he returns to the NAACP after a brief hiatus, he is trying to push that organization to become more outspoken on issues of class and imperialism. And both Robeson and Du Bois, after World War II, become some of the most prominent victims of the Second Red Scare. Now, Robeson is targeted because, well, for one thing, he was one of the most famous men in the world by the end of World War II. And I cannot emphasize enough how much Paul Robeson is an example of the extent to which the federal government would go during the Cold War to destroy someone's reputation. Around 1945, 46 or so, you could go anywhere in the world. You can go to the Soviet Union, to China, to India, to sub-Saharan Africa, to Brazil, to Cuba, to Canada. And if you mention the name Paul Robeson, they knew who you were talking about. You fast forward a generation later, the name Paul Robeson had been virtually forgotten by most people in the United States and around the world. Now, Robeson's outspoken activism would get him in hot water with the government, but it was perhaps Du Bois's activism that would also make him a target of the federal government. And when I mean activism, I'm talking about Du Bois becoming an outspoken opponent of the atom bomb in the 1940s and 50s. Again, we associate Du Bois with Souls of Black Folk, with Dark Water, with Black Reconstruction America, all for good reason. But we have to remember that W.E.B. Du Bois was also alive for the invention of the atom bomb, which he saw as a grave threat to the survival of the human race. Again, remember, Du Bois was born during Reconstruction, and he lives long enough to see the human species invent weapons that could wipe out our entire civilization. And so, of course, Du Bois felt he had to speak out against this. He became increasingly outspoken against the Cold War, against America's rhetoric, anti-communist rhetoric and the like. And that was also true of Paul Robeson. Again, when Du Bois comes to Columbia, South Carolina in 1946 for the Southern Negro Youth Congress's annual convention, he does so with the intention of rallying folks in South Carolina to become part of this global struggle against fascism and for social justice. And by 1950, Du Bois is also including in that a critique of the atom bomb and a critique of American militarism as well. For both Robeson and Du Bois, they argue that the Cold War was not started by the Soviet Union, but they both believe it was an aggressive attempt by the United States to destroy communism all over the world, while at the same time still staying repressive on issues of race and racism within America's borders itself. Now, the federal government went through extraordinary efforts to not only critique, but delegitimize both men. And perhaps the most famous example of this was when Jack Robinson, yes, that Jackie Robinson, was called to testify in front of HUAC in 1949. Now, by 1949, Robinson had been in the major leagues for 3 seasons. He was seen as one of the biggest pioneers in civil rights in the country. And Robinson was asked to speak to HUAC to basically condemn remarks purportedly made by Paul Robeson in Paris, where Robeson said that American Negroes would not fight against the Soviet Union. Now, what Robeson actually said was more along the lines of, you can't ask Negroes to fight in a war against Russia if we don't have civil rights guaranteed at home. But that was truncated to saying Negroes won't fight, period. And Robinson was asked to testify and criticize Robeson. Now, this is where things get very interesting. Robinson does this, but in his same remarks, he does tell Congress directly to their faces, by the way, you can criticize Robeson all you want to, but let's think about where this criticism is coming from. The country hasn't made progress on civil rights. The country hasn't done much on civil rights in the last couple generations or so, since Reconstruction ended. Robinson told HUAC, hey, look, I think what Robeson said was wrong, but I understand where he was coming from. Now, in mainstream press, only Robinson's remarks criticizing Robeson were reported. In the Black press, on the other hand, his full remarks were published. And in his autobiography, I Never Had It Made, Robinson actually later admits that he made a mistake in testifying against Robeson. In fact, he goes so far as to say in his memoir in 1972 that he actually felt Robeson was right. That Robinson was kind of duped into speaking out against Robeson. He regretted it for the rest of his life. And by the way, if you ever read his autobiography, Robinson actually writes even more damning remarks about the U.S. than Robeson ever said. He actually says in his memoir that he will never again salute the American flag. Again, this is Jackie Robinson, right? That's how radicalized he became by the end of his life, too. But Robeson is a marked man. He is being targeted by HUAC. His records are being literally destroyed. In 1949 or so, he gives a concert in Peekskill, New York, that is protested by hundreds, if not thousands, of conservative white Americans. During this concert, union activists and socialists and the like actually form a security ring around the crowd and around Robeson's stage. And this is not in the South. This is in upstate New York. This shows you the extent to which Robeson had become deeply unpopular throughout the country by 1950. The same was true of Du Bois. Du Bois actually runs for the Senate from New York in 1950. It says a great Negro, a great American, U.S. Senator W.E.B. Du Bois. He ran as a member of the American Labor Party in New York State. He actually won about 3.5% to 4% of the vote in 1950. And I love this poster, but I also hate it because I'm like, I wish I could vote for Du Bois. Why couldn't I get a chance to vote for somebody like that in an election? But when Du Bois runs for the Senate in 1950, he does so to bring attention to his concerns about the Cold War and about civil rights at home, too. And by the following year, Du Bois is being heavily targeted by the federal government for his efforts with what's called the Peace Information Center, or the PIC, where Du Bois was speaking out against the atom bomb, against the Cold War. And by 1950-51, this is a serious problem with the U.S. embroiled in the Korean War abroad and with McCarthyism running wild at home in the United States. As the poster says here, the Cicero lynchers in Illinois all went free, but Dr. Du Bois faces jail. This is not hyperbole. Du Bois went on trial because he was accused of being a subversive and being an agent of enemy governments. He really faced jail time. And so Du Bois goes on trial. He wrote about this trial in his book, Battle for Peace. He was represented by Vito. Let me go back a few slides. His lawyer was actually this gentleman, Vito Marcantonio, who was again a congressman from New York. He represents Du Bois in the trial. And during this trial that Du Bois has to endure, keep in mind that Du Bois by this point is out of the NAACP again, this time permanently, because they were worried about being targeted as a subversive organization. Du Bois has lost many of his allies within the civil rights movement. Only really the left and the communists in particular still back Du Bois. And what is interesting is that the trial that Du Bois endures quickly turns into, to some people, a farce, because the government has a difficult time proving their argument that Du Bois was, in essence, a subversive. In fact, the trial is brought to an end by the judge before even the jury can decide Du Bois's fate, because the judge is basically saying, yeah, the federal government totally screwed the pooch on this trial, which was good for them because Du Bois had a character witness ready to testify on his behalf, Albert Einstein, who is remembered today for E=mc², but was also, like I mentioned 2 classes ago, was also an outspoken anti-racist and was actually a supporter of Du Bois and was going to testify on Du Bois's behalf. And the judge said, hey, look, if Einstein shows up here, the government will be even more embarrassed than ever before with this trial. So they let Du Bois go free, but his passport was revoked for several years, along with Paul Robeson. Now, in the aftermath of Robeson and Du Bois's troubles, both men were ostracized from polite society, especially Paul Robeson. But if you don't know anything else about Du Bois and Robeson, you should know that these were two men who were ready and willing to pay any price for the cause of justice and freedom in this country and all throughout the world. And so I want to play the testimony that Paul Robeson gave to HUAC in 1956. Now, this is not actually Paul Robeson's voice. This is actually James Earl Jones reading the script. And again, if you've ever heard Robeson's voice, and you know that only James Earl Jones could have pulled off this voice. So we're going to listen to this, and it gives you a sense, a flavor of the kind of defiance that Robeson displayed during the Cold War era. A defiance born out of a deep commitment to social justice for everyone, not just a few individuals. So let's go ahead and let me just play this. Now, this clip is a little long, but I think it's worth listening to in its entirety.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Oh, please, please, please.
Please answer, will you, Mr. Robeson?
What is the Communist Party? What do you mean by that?
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Would you like to come to the ballot box when I vote and take out the ballot and see?
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully suggest the witness be directed to answer the question.
You are directed to answer the question.
I invoke the Fifth Amendment and forget it.
I respectfully suggest the witness be directed to answer the question whether, if he gave us a truthful answer, he would be supplying information which might be used against him in a criminal proceeding.
You are directed to answer, Mr.
Gentlemen,
Robeson.
in the first place, wherever I have been in the world, the first to die in the struggle against fascism were the communists. I laid many wreaths upon the graves of communists. That is not criminal. Chief Justice Warren has been very clear that the Fifth Amendment does not have anything to do with the influence of criminality, and I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Have you ever been known under the name of John Thomas?
Oh, please, does somebody here want me to put up a perjury someplace? John Thomas, my name is Paul Robeson, and anything I have to say, I have said in public all over the world, and that is why I'm here today.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that you direct the witness to answer the question. He's making a speech.
I ask you to affirm or deny the fact that your Communist Party name was John Thomas.
I invoke the Fifth Amendment. This is really ridiculous.
The witness talks very loud when he makes a speech, but when he invokes the Fifth Amendment, I can't hear him.
I have medals for diction. I can talk plenty loud.
Will you talk a little louder?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment loudly.
Sir, who are Mr. and Mrs. Vladimir
I
Makiev?
invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know a Manning Johnson?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know Gregory Kifitz?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Do you know a Max Jurgen?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Max Jurgen.
Why don't you
took an
have
oath.
these people here to be cross-examined? Could I ask whether this is legal?
This is not only legal, but usual. By unanimous vote, this committee has been instructed to perform this very distasteful task.
To whom am I talking?
You're speaking to the chairman of the committee.
Mr. Walter?
Yes,
The Pennsylvania Walter?
that is right.
Representative of the steel workers?
That is right.
And the coal mining workers?
That is right.
Not United States Steel by any chance. A great patriot.
That is right.
You are the author of the bills that are going to keep all kinds of decent people out of the country.
No, only your kind.
Colored people like myself. And you would let in the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon stock.
We are trying to make it easier to get rid of your kind, too.
You don't want any colored people to come in. Could I be allowed to read from my statement?
Will you just tell this committee, please, while under oath, Mr. Robeson, the communists who participated in the preparation of that statement?
Oh, please. The reason I'm here today, from the mouth of the State Department itself, is I should not be allowed to travel because I have struggled for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. The other reason I'm here today, again, from the State Department and from the record of the Court of Appeals, is that when I am abroad, I speak out against injustices against the Negro people in this land. That is why I'm here. I'm not being tried for whether I'm a communist. I'm being tried for fighting for the rights of my people. who are still second-class citizens in this country, in this United States of America. My mother was born in your state, and my mother was a Quaker. My ancestors, in the time of Washington, baked bread for George Washington's troops when they crossed the Delaware. My father was a slave. I stand here struggling for the rights of my people to be full citizens in this country. And we are not. We are not in Mississippi. We are not in Montgomery, Alabama. We are not in Washington. We are nowhere. And that is why I am here today. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people, for the rights of workers. And I have been on many a picket line for the steel workers, too. And that is why I'm here today.
Would you tell us whether or not you know Thomas W. Young?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment.
Thomas W. Young is a Negro president of the Guide Publishing Company. I'd like to read you his testimony, quote, Paul Robeson has no moral right to place in jeopardy the welfare of the American Negro to advance a foreign cause. In the eyes of the Negro people, this false prophet is unfaithful to their country, and they repudiate him, close quote. Do you know the man that said that?
I invoke the Fifth Amendment now. Can I read my statement? It is a sad and bitter comment.
While you were in Paris in 1949, Mr. Robeson, did you tell an audience the American Negro would never go to war against the Soviet government?
May I say that is slightly out of context? May I explain to you what I did say? I remember the speech very well. 2,000 students who came from populations that would range to 600 or 700 million people asked me to say in their name that they did not want war. No part of my speech in Paris says 15 million American Negroes would do anything. I said it was my feeling that the American people would struggle for peace, and that has been since underscored by the President of these United States. Now, in passing, I said...
Do you know any people who want war?
Listen to me. I said it was unthinkable to me that any people could take up arms in the name of a man like Senator Eastland of Mississippi against anybody. Gentlemen, I still say that. This United States government should go to Mississippi and protect my people. That is what it should do.
I lay before you, sir, an article, quote, I am looking for full freedom, unquote, by Paul Robeson in The Worker. July 3rd, 1949, quote, I said it was unthinkable that the Negro people of America or elsewhere could be drawn into war with the Soviet Union. I repeat it with 100-fold emphasis, they will not, close quote.
And, gentlemen, they have not. It is clear that no Americans are going to go to war with the Soviet Union.
While you were in Stockholm, did you make a little speech?
I made all kinds of speeches.
Let me read you a quotation.
Let me listen.
Do so, please.
I am a lawyer.
It would be a revelation if you would listen to counsel.
In good company, I usually listen. But you know, people wander around in such fancy places.
You said, Mr. Robeson, and I quote, I belong to the American resistance movement, which fights against American imperialism, just as the resistance movement fought against Hitler.
Just like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were underground railroaders and fighting for our freedom, you bet your life.
I have to insist that you listen to these questions.
I am listening.
I quote further, why should the Negroes ever fight against the only nation in the world where racial discrimination is prohibited and where the people can live freely? Never. They will never fight against either the Soviet Union or the people's democracies, close quote. Did you make that statement?
I do not remember, but what is perfectly clear today is that 900 million people, other colored people, have told you they will not. 400 million in India and millions everywhere have told you
The
that.
witness has answered the question. He doesn't need to make a speech.
Did you write an article that was published in the USSR Information Bulletin?
Yes.
Quote, I want to emphasize that only here in the Soviet Union did I feel that I was a real man with a capital M, close quote.
I would say, what is your name?
Errant.
I am quite willing to answer the question. When I was a singer years ago, and this you will have to listen to.
I am listening.
I am a bass singer, so for me, it was Chaliapin, the great Russian bass, not Caruso the tenor. I learned the Russian language to sing their songs. I wish you would listen now.
Mr. Chairman, I ask you to direct the witness to answer the question.
Just be fair with me.
I ask for order.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go
It
so
is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934.
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934.
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. When I did not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. Jefferson could be sitting here, and Frederick Douglass could be sitting here. Eugene Debs could be sitting here.
Now, what prejudice are you talking about? You were graduated from Rutgers. You were graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I remember seeing you play football at Lehigh. There was no prejudice against you.
Just a moment. This is something I challenge very deeply, that the success of a few Negroes can make up for $700 a year for thousands of Negro families in the South. My father was a slave, and I have cousins who are sharecroppers. I do not see success in terms of myself. I have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of dollars for what I believe in.
While you were in Moscow, Mr. Robeson, did you make a speech lauding Stalin?
I can't remember.
Have you recently changed
What
your
has
mind about
happened
Stalin?
to Stalin, gentlemen, is a question for the Soviet Union, and I won't argue with a representative of the people who, in building America, wasted the lives of my people. You are responsible, you and your forebears, for 60 to 100 million black people dying in the slave ships and on the plantations. Don't you ask me about anybody.
I'm sure you wouldn't want to discuss with us the slave labor camps in the
Nothing
Soviet
could be built
Union.
more on slavery than this society, I assure you.
I would invite your attention to the Daily Worker of June 29, 1949, with reference to a get-together with you and Ben Davis, formerly communist councilman in New York. Do you know Ben
One
Davis?
of my dearest friends. He is as patriotic an American as can be, and you, gentlemen, are the non-patriots.
Just a minute.
Are the un-Americans.
The hearing is now adjourned.
I think it should be.
Listen, I
Can
can't.
I read my statement?
No, the meeting is adjourned.
It should be.
Okay, so that's Paul Robeson, June 12th, 1956. And I almost feel like just saying, okay, we're done for the semester. There's something else we could say after that. But all kidding aside, I think again that short exchange between Robeson and Hewitt really showed where Paul Robeson was coming from. They were accusing him of being a communist, and his point was, look, I'm fighting for freedom and justice. If I associate with communists, and so be it. If you call me a communist, and so be it. That's not my concern. And you notice in that clip, every point he made, the congressman could not refute anything he was saying. They tried to talk over him, which is a skill many in Congress are adept at today. But again, that was Paul Robeson in 1956. And as I mentioned before, Robeson's career was destroyed by the Cold War. Now, so much so that I just want to say this very quickly, then we'll move on. When the civil rights movement really picks up full steam in the 1960s, Robeson is almost entirely forgotten about. You notice that testimony was about a year after the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. He mentions Montgomery in his statement. You might recall that for a reason, because the boycott is still going on at that time. By 1964-65, radicals like Malcolm X are starting to say we should reach out to Paul Robeson, get him back in the movement. In fact, there are some who say Malcolm was going to get Robeson back in the movement and he was killed in 1965. By the late 1960s, Robeson is being referred to in the past tense, despite still being alive. That's just how much he was ostracized by mainstream society. Robeson didn't pass away until 1976. And after his death, there were several documentaries made about his life, including The Tallest Tree in Our Forest, other shorter documentaries that were all talking about Robeson. And in fact, I want to mention this, Tallest Tree in Our Forest, which is a great documentary you can find online about Robeson's life. At the end of it, his son, who narrates the documentary, actually says, most of the footage we had of Robeson in this documentary we had to find in Europe. They couldn't find it in the United States because it had all been destroyed or locked away in vaults. The congressman mentioned that Robeson played football at Rutgers, which was true. Robeson was actually so good, he actually at one point was named an All-American. During the Cold War, his All-American status was revoked. And it created the only All-American team in NCAA history that had only 10 players on it, because he was removed from that team. Also, quick side note, Robeson was such a talented person. He actually played in the early version of the NFL. At one point, he actually played against Jim Thorpe, in fact, which is really interesting to think about. But Robeson could have been a lawyer, could have been a football player. He became a singer, an actor, and an activist, and really paid the price for his activism. Du Bois, just mentioned here, he ends up leaving the United States in 1961. He moves to Ghana to live out his last 2 years. He works on the Encyclopedia Africana, which was his lifelong dream of an encyclopedia about the African diaspora. And he passes away a day before Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech in 1963.
Dr. Greene, let me
Yes.
remind our students, and myself included, that Modjeska hosted Du Bois and Robeson at the Township Auditorium in 1948. And that UAC thing you saw was what, 8 years later?
Yes.
And so Modjeska worked with A. Philip Randolph during the work to try and get better deals for Black people in South Carolina during the national Reconstruction stuff. And so the spotlight was on Modjeska because the cops, and this is an important point, no matter what state you're in, you have a police agency, and they kind of, they're like they have a group mind, and they have to have somebody to blame stuff on. And so we had, not J. Edgar Hoover, but we had J. Pete Strom, who looked a lot like J. Edgar Hoover and started out in the 40s as being our state agency. And they were all over Miss Simkins, they were all over me. And so we were, relatively small potatoes, but in South Carolina, you need small potatoes for your budget. And so they've got to make an example out of somebody so they keep getting funding. And so that kind of feeds itself all over the country. But I want you to remember the heat that was on Miss Simkins got her thrown out of. We'll talk about this when we get to 1957. So I don't want to tell you what happens in 1957 yet. Stay tuned.
Okay, well, speaking of 1957, in 1956, the FBI begins the counterintelligence program, better known as COINTELPRO, which is used to investigate a variety of groups. They investigate the Ku Klux Klan, they investigate the NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, oh, yeah, you should know about that. Yeah, SDS, Students for Democratic Society, and so many other organizations. Now, the thing about COINTELPRO is that activists within those movements were aware that they were under FBI surveillance. Like, they kind of had suspicions, they kind of had ideas that, yeah, the FBI is probably investigating what we're doing, listening to us right now. But COINTELPRO was part, again, of a larger national mood that was deeply concerned about activism, especially the idea of quote unquote outside agitators. In a sense, everything we've discussed this evening is about the ultimate outside agitator, of linking movements at home to social movements abroad, whether it's the Soviet Union, decolonization, and the like. In fact, this billboard right here that would have found in the Deep South in the 1950s is an illustration of that. This is the famous Martin Luther King at Communist Training School billboard you saw throughout the South during the Civil Rights era. And this actually shows Dr. King at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where he was receiving training. And it's funny because they know King is in the picture, but ignore Rosa Parks, like right on the end here. But Rosa Parks, King, many others all went and saw what was being done at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. And people keep saying they can't see the slideshow changing. Let me just try this one more time.
I think that's Kevin's own personal connection.
Okay.
I'm getting the slides just fine on my
All
side.
right. I'm just don't want to leave anybody out. But COINTELPRO is the federal version of this kind of investigating. Now, Robeson mentioned Mississippi. some southern states had their own internal security apparatus. Mississippi had the State Sovereignty Commission, which lasted from 1956 until 1977. And in fact, you can also go online. I'll send this link out later this week, so you guys can all see it. They've actually posted online the State Sovereignty Commission's records, at least some of them, about the kind of surveillance they had of Fannie Lou Hamer, of Aaron Henry, other civil rights leaders based in Mississippi, also Dr. King and others who came to the state in the 60s and 70s. And Mississippi really built an apparatus that was notorious throughout the country for just how closely it monitored civil rights activists and their allies in the Magnolia State. But of course, South Carolina could not be left out in the cold. And so the Palmetto State formed the Committee to Investigate Communist Activities in South Carolina. Not exactly the most wieldy acronym in the world, but it would eventually become the Internal Security Committee in 1973. It was headed initially by State Senator John C. West, who is an important figure to note because he would become governor of South Carolina in the 1970s. He was part, ironically enough, of a group of what's referred to as New South Democrats, who were white moderate Democrats in the 70s who were pro-civil rights, who said civil rights movement was a good thing, but were also very hostile to the liberal wing of the Democratic Party and were also deeply, deeply pro-business. This included John C. West and also Jimmy Carter of Georgia, among others. But West became prominent first for his leadership of this committee that investigated communist activities in South Carolina. Unless you think, well, what was there for them to investigate? Let's take a look at some of their records that are actually online and were also part of this week's study guide. So this is the actual book report of the Committee to Investigate Communist Activities in South Carolina from 1971. And what you see here, and let me just zoom in a little bit so everybody can see this in the room. Now, in this report from 1970-71, what they're talking about is not just communism, but also student activism. They say here, they quote J. Edgar Hoover, quote, "There is in today's campus turbulence a new style of conspiracy that is extremely subtle and devious and therefore difficult to understand." Talking about you, Brett, by the way, I hope you know that. But what they're talking about here is they're linking what's going on with activism in South Carolina, specifically in two places. And this is why the report kind of stood out to me. They're talking about places like, scroll down, I just saw this. Okay, places like South Carolina State College or Voorhees, right? And they're referring to, of course, the Orangeburg Massacre, some of the upheaval at Voorhees in the late 60s as well. And of course, by 1970-71, also at USC, where you're having younger South Carolinians really becoming more and more outspoken in their opposition to the way things were in South Carolina. As I say here, the committee is of the opinion that the violence and turbulence that interfered with the normal academic climate of State College at Orangeburg and Voorhees College at Denmark underscores the urgency that boards of trustees, campus officials, and school administrators be promptly and fully informed of all existing laws, relevant to the maintenance of order on the campuses, and the most effective means of enforcing such legislation. And I swear to you, this is not me trying to tie things to current events, but I think you understand why this has relevance right now. We're seeing a lot of campus activism all across the country, but at places like the University of Virginia, UCLA, at Emory, Columbia University, of course, University of Texas at Austin, other places, we are seeing the use of police and law enforcement to an extent on college campuses we haven't seen since 1907. And of course, this report comes out about a year after the massacres at Kent State and Jackson State, and only a few years after the massacre in Orangeburg at SC State as well.
And the politicians have to feed it that same pool that the cops do. Our legislature just passed a punitive bill that would suggest that Zionism is racist.
So again, one of the big lessons of the school is that a lot of these problems from the past have not fully gone away. They've just changed form. And again, the images we're seeing from college campuses right now are actually quite terrifying. I know I have, and I'll just say on a personal, I have friends at a lot of these places too. And I'm hearing from them firsthand accounts of what they're seeing. And when you're seeing police officers loading up automatic rifles and shotguns on unarmed college students and professors, when you see historians literally being thrown to the ground by the police and being thrown off their own college campuses for peaceful protest, you do have to wonder what direction this country is actually going. These are some real stakes that we're talking about here. And I think we're already seeing folks who are saying they're willing to pay a price to speak out against these things. And the kind of government repression that we're talking about here would ultimately target even Martin Luther King Jr., who before 1967 was already being closely monitored by the FBI via the COINTEL program. But Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967 would come out against the war in Vietnam. Now, King didn't come to this lightly. He had actually been prodded by younger activists in SCLC and especially SNCC as early as 1965 to speak out against the war in Vietnam. Now, King was concerned about speaking out against the war, knowing that if he did so, it was virtually guaranteed he would lose access to the White House under President Lyndon Johnson, and it was virtually guaranteed he would lose liberal allies in the civil rights movement, including in the labor movement, including folks like Bayard Rustin and others, who all warned Dr. King to stay in his lane on civil rights. But King refused to think there was this one simple lane for civil rights and a lane for everything else. Throughout his entire adult life, whether you look at letters he wrote to Coretta Scott in the 1950s, papers he wrote to college and graduate school, sermons he gave at Dexter Avenue and Ebenezer Baptist churches, we know that Dr. King always had a more holistic critique of American and world society. His belief in the idea of the beloved community was not just about race, but also a key component of it. It was also a critique of materialism and a staunch critique of imperialism as well. On April 4th, 1967, Dr. King gave perhaps the most important speech of his career, titled Beyond Vietnam, at Riverside Church in New York. April 4th, 1967. Exactly a year before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, we're getting close to the 8 o'clock hour here, but I do want to play a few minutes of this speech because, as I always tell my students at Claflin, every Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the media plays the exact same part of the exact same speech, the I Have a Dream speech. And even, by the way, I just want to get on my soapbox for a second here. Even with the I Have a Dream speech, they always play the same part. Because if you read or listen to the entire thing, it is actually much more radical than they let on. But if you only hear part of the I Have a Dream speech, you damn sure don't hear this speech Beyond Vietnam, where Martin Luther King Jr. directly answers the question, well, why are you speaking out on Vietnam? Why should a civil rights activist get out of his lane and talk about foreign policy? But if you're Dr. King, if you believe in a beloved community, if you believe that human beings all over the world are tied together, in a web of mutual trust and care for one another. And there's no reason in the world that borders or lines on a map should stop you from speaking out for justice. So I want to play a few minutes of this particular speech. And then I think we can kind of get into a couple other things in the Q&A. So I want to go ahead and pull up the speech. This is actually from the link Brett sent out earlier today.
This is in the study guide.
Yeah.
And it's the best I've found in decades of reading this.
So actually, let me make
You can read along as you hear it.
right. Just make sure. Okay, here we go.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I need not pause to say how very delighted I am to be here tonight, and how very delighted I am to see you expressing your concern about the issues that will be discussed tonight by turning out in such large numbers. I also want to say that I consider it a great honor to share this program with Dr. Bennett, Dr. Comminger, and Rabbi Heschel, and some of the distinguished leaders and personalities of our nation. And of course, it's always good to come back to Riverside Church. Over the last 8 years, I have had the privilege of preaching here almost every year in that period. It is always a rich and rewarding experience to come to this great church and this great program. I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's own bosom and in the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do, in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony. But we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision. But we must speak. And we must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance. For we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live. In the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This speech is not addressed to Hanoi or to the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or to Russia. Nor is it an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Neither is it an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue, not to overlook the role they must play in the successful resolution of the problem. While they both may have justifiable reasons to be suspicious of the good faith of the United States, life and history give eloquent testimony to the fact that conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides. Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, but rather to my fellow Americans. Since I am a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. That is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it was some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place, and it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Holland. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watched them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realized that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightly so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problem, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. For those who ask,
I hate to stop it there, but the entire speech is about almost an hour. And again, this was sent out as one of the links, for the study guide material. So I would highly, highly encourage everyone in the class to either read the speech or listen to it, or better yet, do both when you have some time this week, because it's, again, we only got like the first 3 reasons for why he's giving this speech, but each reason was very powerful in its own right. And he's trying to tell both his audience in 1967 and us listening today why these various issues of civil rights, of human rights, of militarism, of materialism, why they are all linked together. You can't just draw out one and focus on that one issue. You have to provide a more holistic analysis of these social problems.
I'm not quite as polite as Dr. Greene. I insist that you read or listen to this speech. It gets better as it goes on, but there's a line in there that I've embraced since I first heard it, probably within the year after it was given. And Modjeska lifted it up. She was banned from giving a speech on a radio show that she had here in Columbia in 1966 because she was coming out against the war in Vietnam. There's a copy of it that's posted at the Modjeska papers at the university, and it's written in hand across the top of it, rejected in its entirety. But in that speech, Dr. King uses a line that I've been using ever since we started the school, and that what we're calling for now is a radical revolution of values. That's Dr. King's words. We're not talking about overthrowing the government. We're talking about changing the values of the people that live here and the people that run the country. It's a different struggle, and it requires a transformation that a movement has to rely on.
And to that end, I wanted to just finish up here with a couple of things. I saw Blake ask in the chat about Muhammad Ali, and that's actually my very next slide. One thing that's important to note is that when King comes out against the war in Vietnam, as I mentioned a moment ago, he loses a lot of support, a lot of allies. Lyndon Johnson is angered at King. He doesn't let him come up to the White House. King loses a lot of support in the labor movement and amongst other civil rights activists, especially in the NAACP. And they're all saying that the Vietnam War is a foreign policy issue. More importantly, the NAACP and Bayard Rustin and others are all saying Lyndon Johnson's been our friend on civil rights for years now. We have to back him on Vietnam. Ironically enough, after King's assassination, all those groups eventually come out against the war. But King was out before them. Also, Muhammad Ali comes out against the war even before King. He comes out against the war in 1966 because he refuses induction for the draft. Now, the thing about this story that's worth noting is that when Ali received his draft notice, the U.S. Army basically said, you're not going to see any actual combat. We're going to use you in the USO, entertain the troops, that sort of thing. He wasn't going to be actually fighting. But Ali was still deeply opposed to the war, and he argued that he was a conscientious objector, and he also argued that his issues of oppression were not coming from the Vietnamese, they were coming from his fellow Americans. And so Ali would fight a multi-year battle to avoid being drafted, that would go to the Supreme Court. But between 1967 to 1970, Ali would lose some of the prime years of his boxing career and thousands, if not millions of dollars that he would have made fighting to protest the war in Vietnam. And this is actually a photograph from King and Ali meeting in later 1967 as they're both talking about the issue of Vietnam as well. Now, one other thing I want to make mention of that Brett alluded to a moment ago is that you have these stories of repression coming from the federal government and from various state governments too. It's also worth noting that even within the civil rights movement, leaders like Modjeska Simkins were also facing considerable criticism from allies within the civil rights movement. By the mid-1950s, Simkins herself had been removed from the state NAACP and found herself on the outside looking in. She was seen as being too radical for the movement. She was seen as being far too radical on a variety of social issues. And in the mid-1950s, Simkins leads the way in creating what she called citizens committees. Here in Columbia and Richland County, she formed the Richland County Citizens Committee, which essentially operated as a parallel organization to the NAACP. This became especially important in the late 1950s as states like South Carolina and others began to target NAACP activists directly, basically saying that if you say work for the state government, if you were a school teacher, et cetera, and if you were caught being an NAACP member, you could actually lose your job in the process. For Simkins, this was a way to let people who want to be involved in activism still do so while not having to go through the NAACP, which, by the way, Simkins herself was starting to see as being a bit too moderate for her taste in South Carolina by the mid to late 1950s. So again, these stories of repression and oppression are stories about the federal, state, and local governments in this country, but they're also stories of resistance and ultimately hope, and most importantly, stories of organizing, finding new, unique ways to actually organize.
Dr. Greene,
Yes.
Ms. Simkins started the Citizens Committee back when the NAACP was being targeted. She called it a shadow NAACP, because that's not us, that's this. By 57, she has run out of the NAACP state conference that she was a founder of because of her being associated with people that leaned left. So she immediately started the Richland County Citizens Committee and kept doing what she was doing as the militant organizer in the NAACP. And that's when I got up with her, was during her Richland County Citizens Committee time, and she was working with us at GROW. We were like her her roadies and her publicity office. And so she was irrepressible in that she used that statement, making a way out of no way, that we all need to learn from.
Definitely, definitely. And I think at this point, I would like to take some questions from the audience. Are there any questions at all about what we've discussed this evening? Any questions? And if you're on Zoom, you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. If you're in the room with us, please go ahead and speak up.
Dr. Reed, while we're waiting for people to get ready, would you please hold this up?
Sure.
And tell people that the next couple of classes, this is just part of your study guide. If you want a hard copy, send us an email to the network at scpronet.com. We'll mail you one if you're not in Columbia. If you're in Columbia, come get one. But this is a book that covers the local movement of what we would call the New Left from the mid-60s until the late 80s.
Exactly. And I'm going to put a link. I think there's a PDF.
It's online.
Yes, I'll put a link to that in the chat too. Okay, but while I do so, any questions at all? Any questions? Okay, so this is a question from Annie. Do you have any documentaries to recommend on this particular era? I do. I'll send a couple out via email this week. Brett, you whispering something to me as well. Do you have anyone to recommend to you? Reds. Well, see, okay, so Reds is a great movie.
That's early.
Yes.
1970.
Well, so Reds is a movie starring Warren Beatty and some other famous actors from that time period. Made in 1981, but it's about John Reed, who was an American journalist who goes to Russia in 1917 to investigate the Russian Revolution. Eventually becomes an American who gets wrapped up in the revolution. It's also about radicalism in the United States. So folks like Emma Goldman are in the film. It's very much showing you how the IWW is heavily involved. It's a great film. We've talked about showing it here at Grow. Only thing about Reds, also Reds is great because it's a movie, but also it features interviews with actual folks who were involved in activism in the 19 teens who were like very advanced in age. So this is their last chance to talk about these things. It comes out during the first year of the Reagan administration, which makes it especially noteworthy. But it's a long film too. It's about 3.5 hours or so. So you might want to have like a full spread out and some bathroom breaks ready to go. But it's worth it. It is a fantastic film. I know there are some other great documentaries too. Do you have any you want to recommend besides Reds?
There's Eyes on the Prize.
Okay, so Eyes on the Prize is rather interesting. Eyes on the Prize is a great multi-episode documentary about the civil rights movement. But what I will say about Eyes on the Prize is this. There are actually two main parts to Eyes on the Prize. The first part is the one that's best known. It covers everything from Brown v. Board up to the Selma March 1965. That's the part most folks, I think, have seen. It's actually also available on HBO Max. I think also on Canopy as well. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's definitely HBO Max because everything, of course, has to be monetized now. But with Eyes on the Prize, there's also a second part as well that I don't think as many folks have seen. Eyes on the Prize 2 covers 66 on to like 1980 or so. And it talks about the Black Power movement. It talks about the growth of Black politics in the 70s. And it gets into the question of, well, how much was achieved with the civil rights movement and how much remained to be done? And what's funny is part 2 is not on HBO Max. In fact, part 2 used to be on YouTube and I cannot find it anymore. It's very difficult to find. I think because it raises some difficult questions about the movement itself and what it achieved, what it didn't achieve, that sort of thing. Eyes on the Prize is a great one. There is a couple of wonderful Paul Robeson documentaries I mentioned earlier in class today. I'll make sure you get links to those. And in terms of this time period in general, in terms of this time period in general, I have to think a bit more about other documentaries, but we'll certainly have some more to recommend to you. Okay. Okay, Sandy has a question. What happened conclusive to the hearing of Paul Robeson with the HUAC committee? So I think what you're asking is what happened after that. In essence, eventually HUAC was really just forced to let Robeson go. They had thoroughly destroyed his career. They had taken away had temporarily revoked his passport. But eventually, by the end of the 1950s, Robeson would get access to his passport once again and would resume traveling to Europe and the Soviet Union. This becomes especially important later in life for Robeson because he has to seek medical treatment in the Soviet Union for ailments, some of which people believe were actually caused by the CIA or anything else, where he was greatly sickened, he was suffering some form of psychosis. And this is another reason why he spent the 60s and 70s basically in isolation, because he was in very poor health for the rest of his life. And Cecil points out, if you have a public library card, you have access to Canopy. Eyes on the Prize is also on Canopy as well.
James Baldwin, there's a really good James Baldwin film, and the brother of the Bertrand. Help me. The
Bayard Rustin.
Rustin,
Brother Outsider.
Brother Outsider.
Yes.
And those are both of those. Brother Outsider is about Bayard Rustin. And Bayard was not only leaning left, but he was also gay. And he was like kept getting pushed out of things. Really good documentary about him. And then the one on that James Baldwin does is just makes you realize that James Baldwin was really worth reading. Yeah, those are both at the library.
Yeah, and again, I think the most important thing here is that make sure you use your local library privileges, because again, they have access to Canopy, they have books at the library, etc. Let's go ahead and use our public libraries while we still have them.
And when you can't, go to Liberation is Lit.
Exactly, exactly. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, please.
Obviously, comment and question. The parallels are very stark about what's happening, what was happening then, what's happening now. The bill that you mentioned, Brett, that's also going to the federal level. There's 1161, which wants to use the same IHRA definition of anti-Semitism had the Department of Education use that same definition as well, which will again lead to more crackdown. But there was another bill that I heard about today, 934, and because you mentioned espionage and sedation, it says expresses the sense of House of Representatives that regular journalistic activities are protected under First Amendment, and the United States ought to drop all charges against and attempts to extradite Julian Assange. So one of the things I think in that bill is that they were getting him under espionage charges for reporting journalistic activities. Were there similar cases back in history where people reporting what had been done by the government were then being brought up on espionage charges?
You know, to an extent, yes, you do have some situations like that where journalists in particular are at risk, especially involving some of the war we're fighting abroad in the 20th century. What's that?
The Pentagon Papers.
Yeah, the Pentagon Papers are a perfect example of this, where Daniel Ellsberg, who once worked in the federal government, creates copies of papers from the Pentagon that explain how America got involved in Vietnam. They go back to Eisenhower and Kennedy and LBJ, and he gets these papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and also I think to CBS News, and they run with these stories. And Ellsberg is targeted by the Nixon administration for leaking these documents to the public. I'll give you another example, though, that isn't as well known. So I mentioned W.B. Du Bois earlier today. After World War I, Du Bois actually goes to France to personally investigate the conditions under which Black troops fought in the Great War. And what he finds is that, not surprisingly, they faced a lot of discrimination from their own army in France. They were accused of cowardice and things that were not actually true. And at one point, Du Bois even gets some army documents and leaks them to the press. And he knows that by doing this, he also faces the risk of being charged under the Espionage and Sedition Act as well. Ultimately, he avoids that happening because the government is embarrassed more than anything else by the documents and what they have to say about what Black troops actually endured in Europe. But you're right. There's also not only the issue of the oppression of freedom of speech, but also within that problems of freedom of the press also being greatly curtailed, not just during wartime, but also in terms of how things like the civil rights movement are being reported on, for example. So this is a bit to the side of your question, but when we think about the civil rights era and how it's being reported, or even before that, just reporting on activism in the South and across the country, the Black press is a really important part of the story. And Black journalists in particular face not just these questions of freedom of the press, but they faced real physical violence going down South and reporting on things like the Emmett Till case or the bus boycotts or the student movements going on throughout the South at that time. So again, we don't want to forget what journalists were going through in this time period too, because they're facing attacks from federal government and from local authorities too. I think I saw another hand in the back. Yes, go ahead, please.
Did Albert Einstein get investigated or targeted?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. No, go ahead, please.
I stumbled on a little book I hadn't seen before, and it was about Einstein being an anti-racist, finding out that Paul Robeson was born in Princeton. Paul Robeson is very famous as a radical, comes back to Princeton, and Einstein's there, and Einstein's getting heat. And this book recounts them taking walks in Princeton together, conspiring against nuclear war and things like that. So yeah, Einstein was definitely on the list. They had him ID'd, and he couldn't be involved with the Manhattan Project and the bombing and the making of the bomb. And Einstein said, one of our quotes, that's on one of our posters for the anti-nuclear stuff, all things have changed since the splitting atom saved man's wisdom, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. Another subversive.
Right. I mean, I think basically what's worth noting is that if there is anyone you actually like in American history, chances are they were thought of as a subversive when they were alive, and now they're on the postage stamp. Oh, we didn't even mention Helen Keller, right? Helen Keller, who is best remembered as being an activist for disability rights. She was also a proud and prominent socialist. She was very outspoken in her anti-war stance on a variety of wars in American history. She was outspoken on issues of capitalism and the like, but her radicalism is kind of downplayed in favor of looking at her as an early champion of the rights of the blind and the deaf. But for Keller, she often argued that her being blind and deaf was linked to her opposition to war and her belief in socialism, because she's saying, I want to make a better world for everyone, regardless of their bodily condition, their race, their gender, etc. Again, like King, like others who discussed this evening, she saw all these issues as being tightly linked together. Okay, there's a question in the chat from Greg. Can you comment on immigration reform that was enacted along with the civil rights movement and how its legacy of undermining the goals of the civil rights movement? So what Greg's referring to is the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, known as the Hart-Celler Act. To make a very, very, very long story short, that we kind of referenced briefly, talking about the radicals of 1900s and 1910s like Emma Goldman. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, you had massive waves of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to the United States. Now, what's worth noting, by the way, is that many immigrants who came to the US actually went back to their home countries during this period too. Not everybody stayed here. Some of them made money in the US and went back to, say, Italy or elsewhere in Europe. But by 1924, thanks to a conservative wave throughout the country that was opposed to more immigration, because many Americans linked immigration to the rise of radicalism in the US, by 1924, Congress puts into place serious restrictions on immigration from all over the world. This wasn't the first time Congress had done that. Of course, in the late 19th century, there were restrictions on immigration from China and later Japan to the United States. But in 1924, Congress put in its most restrictive act yet, controlling immigration, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. You fast forward about 2 generations later, in 1965, Congress passes the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was supported by Senator Philip Hart of Michigan and Representative Emanuel Seller of New York. And basically what this law did was it overhauled immigration to the US. It took out some of the older quota restrictions on people who come from Europe and elsewhere, and instead really increased immigration from Latin America, from Africa, from East and South Asia. And it was really seen as a bill that was linked to some of the broader social movements of that time. This is coming on the heels of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, the creation of Johnson's War on Poverty. All these acts were seen as ways of pushing the country forward on a wide range of issues. Now, since the bill was passed in '65, though, it has been seen as one of the reasons for increased immigration to the US by a variety of groups, not just from Latin America, but from all over the world. And again, folks have noted that it being passed at the same time as the civil rights movement reaches its apex is not a coincidence. But of course, there are questions raised today about what is to be done with immigration in the decades to come, especially as immigration continues to be a wedge issue for many Americans and a deeply complicated and emotional one for many Americans. I'll just tell one quick story and I'll shut up. When I was in college, I had a friend of mine who was from Mexico. And I will never forget the day that he told me, and he told me this in the privacy of his own apartment. He whispered this to me, that he was in the country illegally. It wasn't his fault. He and his mother moved to the US when he was 10. She was a very hardworking woman. They loved it here so much, they just decided to stay here. And he told me that there were certain things he couldn't do as an undocumented immigrant. He couldn't get a driver's license. He couldn't do certain other things. But what I'll never forget is how much he actually loved this country. And so I had a lot of friends in college. This is back in 2006 when we last had a big debate about immigration and immigration reform. I had a lot of friends who were deeply opposed to amnesty for undocumented immigrants and the like. And I kept thinking about my friend. Now, since that time, he's gotten married, he's gotten American citizenship and all of that. But it is a topic that we're having to deal with here in South Carolina, for instance. It's a topic we have to deal with all throughout the country, but especially in the South, that's seeing some of the highest growing rates of Hispanic populations. And again, this is the kind of stuff that activists were dealing with in the 60s and 70s as well. Again, linking all these various issues into one thread. And again, we should not also forget that a good bit of immigration from Latin America is caused by American foreign policy actions in Latin America, the destabilization of several countries. Some of this we'll talk about in the classes to come.
Dr. Greene, the takeaway on this immigration thing, it's this is recurrent theme. If you watch Nazi Town USA, some of the languages people were using in the 30s is the exact language that Trump's using now. And the commonality is a way to play working people off against the immigrants because they're the problem, not the people causing the problems. And so it's a diversion tactic that continues to seem to work. And that is one of the reasons that the educational level of Republicans has dropped down to below high school.
All right, well, on that cheerful note, for next week, we're going to talk about Vietnam and the role that this state played both in the support for the war in Congress and the executive branch of government, and also the opposition to that war as well. And next week, we'll also finish up some material on civil rights in South Carolina. and look at how both civil rights in Vietnam produced more radicalized South Carolinians. But above all, we don't want to forget that South Carolina has always played a key role in American domestic and foreign policy, sometimes for better, many times for the worst. But that's all the more reason why we have a lot of work to do in this state on the ground. So that's coming up next Monday. In the meantime, of course, this Sunday is Mother's Day. So please go, if you can, it's possible, call your mama, go see your mama, tell her Happy Mother's Day. Just remember this Sunday is Mother's Day. So keep that in mind. If you want to have a good next Monday, make sure to celebrate Mother's Day if you can with your mother.
That presumes a lot.
What's that?
Yeah.
Louis Pitts.
So Louis Pitts will also be here with us next Monday as well. Is that right?
That's what I'm asking you, Becky. Becky, is Pitts up?
I don't think
Monday?
that's next Monday.
On class 10 is Vietnam on May 13th. On the 19th, we have an African lesson with Dr. Gallman. And on May 20th, we have a class with Louis Pitts.
Okay. All right. So again, more to come. There's a lot more to come. We're hitting our stride this semester. Again, also start thinking about what projects you might want to get involved with the Progressive Network, whether it's Missing Voter Project, the Monuments Tour, or if you have an idea for a project of your own, also start thinking about that. As we get closer to the end of the semester, start thinking about projects to apply what we've learned here to helping our communities in South Carolina and beyond.
And these are activities you can do in any small town in South Carolina. And those of you that are in the room need to make sure you sign up there so you get all your gold stars for attending class.
All right, so on that note, have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we'll see you all once again next Monday.
Thank you, Dr. Greene.
Thanks, Dr. Greene.